Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Reptile Barn. I wanted to see if you guys would be interested if I were to, once every week or two, do a vlog talking about a conservation issue. Usually like reptile and amphibian conservation, right? Because that's what we like. I love conservation. I went to school for wildlife conservation. I actually teach a homeschool class for reptile conservation. I really like talking about it. So if it's something you would be interested in hearing about, watch the videos. So I'm going to do one today, see if you guys like it. And if you do, I'll keep making them. If you don't, we'll just stick to our regular stuff, and that's totally fine. Today, I'm going to talk about blue tree monitors, Varanus macraei. Let me go show you one so you know what they look like if you've never seen one. Tree monitors, well, all the tree monitors are among the smallest of the varanids, which is just the monitor lizards. It's a little late in the evening, so he's kind of going to bed. I'll show ours to you. This is a nearly adult male that we've got. So let me zoom in. Okay. Hopefully I'm showing him to you. I can't see where I'm pointing the screen. There we go. Yeah. So that is a blue tree monitor. And I'll find a good picture of one of ours for the thumbnail, or you can just look them up. Anyway, why is this a conservation issue? Well, just this week, U.S. Fish and Wildlife put out an emergency order listing blue tree monitors as endangered. This is a big deal. Potentially, for me, a very sad big deal. But I want to give you a different perspective than what most, not all, to be fair, but most of the reptile people in our kind of hobby are saying about this. So I don't want to misrepresent anyone. I'm not going to name any names, but from what I have seen, most people are enraged over this. The videos, the posts, and comment sections are full of anger, even like hatred towards U.S. Fish and Wildlife, right? Why? Well, because this would effectively shut down blue tree monitor breeding and selling. Because if you are listed as endangered on the Endangered Species Act, you cannot be moved across state lines. I think there's exceptions if you're like an accredited zoo, but basically for all of us in the hobby, it's over. Can't move them across state lines. So if you're in like Florida or a state with a huge population and there's like multiple people breeding them, maybe that state can kind of limp along, but basically we're done, right? And they made this order effective immediately. I believe there's like a 230-day period or something along those lines, and then they will make their decision final. So we can appeal, which we need to, but this video, I want to be talking about the conservation side of things, why I don't feel so much hatred towards U.S. Fish and Wildlife, how we need to be more nuanced about this as hobbyists, etc. And maybe what some alternatives might be to just listing them as endangered, which I think is probably overkill, right? So first off, why does everyone hate them? Well, first, because they really have been overbearing in many situations. A few of them have been downright awful in situations that affect the reptile hobby. Truly awful, right? At either a state level or a federal level. So there's these big cases that have gone down that make everybody mad, and that's what gets all the eyeballs. So everyone just assumes that's U.S. Fish and Wildlife. That's what they do. They just go around and screw people and ruin everything. Well, that's not true. But I can see how if that's all you ever hear about them, of course you're going to think that. But I know some of them. I studied alongside many of them when I was in college, who are now there. The vast majority of them are animal lovers. but their passion is on the scientific and conservation side of things. So it's not their top priority and their kind of intrinsic desire to preserve the business side, the hobbyist side, the captive breeding. They're worrying about populations in the wild, environmental degradation, right? That's their concerns. So while some of them can be communicated with and worked with and are reasonable, other ones are very set in their ways and are not so reasonable. Just like every industry, like ours, for example, right? Um, Now, the Endangered Species Act, this is kind of my first hope, I guess, is that the appeal will be able to convince U.S. Fish and Wildlife when they make their final decision, sometime in the fall, I think, to downgrade the listing from endangered to threatened for a few reasons. First, because I actually doubt that U.S. Fish and Wildlife agents have done the boots on the ground surveys, high quality wildlife surveys in Batanta, Indonesia, to actually have data showing that, yes, they're absolutely endangered. We're certain of it. That seems unlikely to me, right? To put it mildly. And then, second, because a listing of threatened, while it will offer a lot of protections to the wild population, as in no more wild ones will be imported into our country, which is a huge part of the wild caught trade in blue tree monitors, are just the United States. We're a large part of the market. It will not be so detrimental to the captive bred side of things, right? If an animal is listed endangered, you're out of luck. It is not moving across state lines. If it's listed as threatened, you can get a permit. And despite what you may have heard, it's not that hard. I've done it many times. The example I use is the eastern indigo snakes that we keep. They are listed as threatened, and I just get a permit. It's not difficult. I don't know where this concept came, that it's this horrible, giant to do that's so difficult, and that even if you do it perfectly, they're probably going to reject you. None of that is true. If you can read decently, you can get this permit, right? It takes a few months. It's the government. Of course, it's slow. It costs like $100, but who cares, right? It's not that big of a deal. Excuse me. So if they were listed as threatened, we would still be able to carry on, right? Would it slow things down? Yes, it would. And would it have some negative impact? Yeah, I think it still would, because the total numbers being bred in captivity in our country would go down, because the demand would go down, because a ton of people would be unwilling to get the permit. They wouldn't want to wait a couple of months. They wouldn't want to pay the $100, and they'd be intimidated by the paperwork. So that's unfortunate, but at least we could carry on. And I think from a conservation perspective, we need to carry on. Okay. In the last 10 years, and I don't have data on this. This is just my opinions, right? But I think I'm right. I would guess that the number of people in the United States successfully breeding and hatching and raising captive bred blue tree monitors has gone up 20-fold. Okay? The success rate has boomed. And for the first time ever, we're able to put some pressure on the wild caught trade, which is a good thing when you have a population that is apparently threatened, at least. And I think that's probably true, by the way. This is one of the things where I disagree with the hobby. They should be listed as something. We shouldn't be importing them from the wild into captivity anymore. We have plenty of them in captivity. We have a diverse genetic base for this species in captivity. We should not be importing them. None of the countries who are importing them should be allowing it. The Indonesia shouldn't be allowing the export. if your main goal is to preserve the wild population. Now, at the beginning of any captive project, you're trying to breed them, you have to have some wild caught animals. Of course, that's where they are, right? So I'm not against the wild caught trade necessarily, but once you have established them in captivity strongly, then the wild caught trade, if the wild population is at all threatened, should go away, right? That's where I thought they went wrong. Just list them as threatened, or even go to the legislature and write a new law that isn't the Endangered Species Act that only regulates the wild caught trade, right? So that there's some sort of formula preset into the law where U.S. Fish and Wildlife has the ability to take a census of the captive population of any given species, and when it hits certain benchmarks, we have this many people successfully breeding them, the production is this high, the purchasing base is whatever. At this point, we're going to start to restrict the wild caught trade, importing them from the wild, right? And as the captive population gets stronger and stronger and stronger, you restrict that more and more and more until it just goes away, right? Now, is that even necessary? Maybe not. Let me point to reticulated pythons, with the huge caveat, of course, that the natural range of reticulated pythons is huge compared to blue tree monitors. Blue tree monitors are only from Batanta, Indonesia, one island, right? And retics are all over Southeast Asia, several countries, right? Countries, not just one island. So there are differences here, but let me still explain my thought process. 40 years ago, if you wanted to buy a retic, you were almost certainly buying a wild-caught retic. It was going to be real angry, very scared of people, possibly carrying diseases, and absolutely carrying a huge parasite load, okay? Their lifespan was shorter. The likelihood of them biting you was 100%, and they were difficult. It was difficult to breed them. They weren't easy to acclimate to captive setting, and that sucked, I'm sure. Now, a few people started successfully breeding them. At first, those babies were obviously going to be very, very expensive. And that's where I've seen a few people regarding the blue tree monitors who are like, breeding them in captivity doesn't help with conservation. They're way more expensive than wild caught. They can't put the wild caught trade out of business. Not overnight, not even over 4 or 5 years, but over a decade or two, absolutely they can. Let me come back to the retics now. So, why was anyone willing to buy a captive bred retic if it was 10 times, 20 times the price of an import? Well, because its temperament was worlds better. It had no parasites, it had no diseases, and some people were like, well, that's worth it, right? I'll spend $1,000 instead of $100 for this pet that I'm going to have for a very long time, that doesn't want to kill me, that's not going to be pooping tapeworms all over the cage. You know what I mean? Not covered in ticks. So to some people, it was worth it. As they made those purchases, the breeders were able to expand their operations. A few more people figured out how to breed them. And basic supply and demand made it so that as the number of retics being bred went up, the price went down. That's how it works. And now, fast forward to today, do you know of anyone still importing and selling psychopath, parasite-riddled retics? I don't. I'm not saying there's nobody importing them, but the vast majority of retics that are sold as pets are captive bred. Their temperament is, for the most part, fantastic. Their health is fantastic. There's all sorts of cool colors and patterns. Why would you ever get a wild caught? And there's so many of them being bred, you don't have to pay thousands of dollars if you don't want to. You can buy a real classic, normal-looking retic very inexpensively, right? You can't keep it very inexpensively because they eat big food and need big spaces, but that's another thing. So with that example, I see the blue tree monitor experience with this industry towards the first third of that process, people are starting to really figure it out. The number of people breeding them has skyrocketed. Production is starting to go up. I would have bet that in 2 or 3 years from now, the price would have started dramatically dropping for captive bred blue tree monitors, and the demand for wild caught would have plummeted. The same thing would have happened that happened with retics, right? And it would have happened organically without the government having to mandate anything. The danger is, what if we pushed their wild population past a point of no return in that period? That's why they regulate. Now, if they're being honest and doing their job right, that's why they regulate. Sometimes people in any position of power are going to abuse their power. But for the most part, they're listing animals as threatened or endangered that are actually threatened or endangered, right? They're not listing ball pythons in the wild as endangered because they're not. So, with all this information, I agree with a lot of reptile keepers that this decision was probably too much. They don't have data to support it, and there's going to be some detriment to a complete, not just detriment, but an annihilation of the captive bred trade in our country. Canada will still be going strong. Europe will still be going strong. However, governments watch each other. This could have a ripple effect, and that would be devastating if other governments start listing them as endangered under whatever their form of that legislation is. That would be really bad. What if our Fish and Wildlife starts eyeballing the other species of tree monitors? That would be a darn shame. So we need to appeal, but without all the vitriol and the personal attacks and the really childish behavior, that won't change their mind, right? Even if you were correct in feeling that way, which I don't think you are, but even if you were, behaving like that is never going to get us what we want, right? Acting cool and rational and trying to be collaborative is what's going to get us places if the people making this decision are reasonable. Right? So I'm kind of in the middle because sometimes they're not reasonable. I am not trying to say all these government officials at this agency are wonderful. They all do a perfect job. They've never made a mistake and their motives are all pure. I'm not saying that. But treating them all like monsters is not going to get us what we want. And what we want is, at the very least, for this species to be downgraded from endangered to threatened so that we can still keep them, breed them, buy them, sell them, move them across state lines. We just need a permit, right? Couple last points before I finish this. I hope this has been enjoyable, right? I know this is different from our typical content, but one thing that I think is important is that USARK, the lobbyist group for reptile keepers here in the US, they've been practically begging Blue Tree Monitor people to reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, to comment at meetings. It's not just Blue Tree Monitors. I've seen really sad posts where they're like, hey, Louisiana is passing this law. Massachusetts is trying to pass this law. This law has been proposed in this city, whatever. We need reptile keepers to come to the meetings, make public comments, send in letters, show the people making these decisions that we are a legitimate industry. Let them know we even exist. And I've seen times where USARK will put out something where they're like, guess what? One person showed up. And we happen to know there are 57 reptile keepers in this community. Where are you? Now your animals are going to be taken away because you didn't do anything, right? So do something when that comes up. Follow USARK. They are on top of these alerts. They will show you when a law that seems ridiculous is being proposed in your area or even nationally. And they try to lobby for us, but they need us to show up, right? And related to that, let your congressmen and your senators know that we exist and that some of these national level laws are affecting us in a really bad way without giving as much protection to the wild populations as the laws were designed to do. Write them letters or emails or whatever, right? Get involved, or nothing is going to happen the way we want it to. All it's going to happen is the bad thing's going to happen, and then we're all going to complain about it. Let's do the complaining in a productive way before the bad thing happens, right? It can make a difference. It doesn't always, but it can. I have one example that I think I'm going to actually put into another video because we're over 20 minutes here. Please let me know if this was interesting to you guys. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't need to keep doing these, but if you like it, I have all sorts of reptile conservation topics that I would love to get into and spread information about. So anyway, as always, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, we're the Reptile Barn.